Part 2. Currency War. Chapter 3. Reflections on a Golden Age. We're in the midst of an international currency war. Guido Mantega, Finance Minister of Brazil, September 27, 2010. I don't like the expression currency war. Dominique Strauss-Kahn, Managing Director, IMF, November 18, 2010. A currency war, fought by one country through competitive devaluations of its currency against others, is one of the most destructive and feared outcomes in international economics. It revives ghosts of the Great Depression, when nations engaged in beggar-thy-neighbor devaluations and imposed tariffs that collapsed world trade. It recalls the 1970s, when the dollar price of oil quadrupled because of U.S. efforts to weaken the dollar by breaking its link to gold. Finally, it reminds one of crises in UK pound sterling in 1992, Mexican pesos in 1994, and the Russian ruble in 1998, among other disruptions. Whether prolonged or acute, these and other currency crises are associated with stagnation, inflation, austerity, financial panic, and other painful economic outcomes. Nothing positive ever comes from a currency war. So it was shocking and disturbing to global financial elites to hear the Brazilian Finance Minister Guido Mantega flatly declare in late September 2010 that a new currency war had begun. Of course, the events and pressures that gave rise to Mantega's declaration were not new or unknown to these elites. International tension on exchange rate policy, and by extension, interest rates and fiscal policy, had been building even before the depression that began in late 2007. China had been repeatedly accused by its major trading partners of manipulating its currency, the yuan, to an artificially low level and of accumulating excess reserves of U.S. Treasury debt in the process. The panic of 2008, however, cast the exchange rate disputes in a new light. Suddenly, instead of expanding, the economic pie began to shrink, and countries formerly content with their share of a growing pie began to fight over the crumbs. Despite the obvious global financial pressures that had built up by 2010, it was still considered taboo in elite circles to mention currency wars. Instead, international monetary experts used phrases like rebalancing and adjustment to describe their efforts to realign exchange rates to achieve what were thought by some to be desired goals. Employing euphemisms did not abate the tension in the system. At the heart of every currency war is a paradox. While currency wars are fought internationally, they are driven by domestic distress. Currency wars begin in an atmosphere of insufficient internal growth. The country that starts down this road typically finds itself with high unemployment, low or declining growth, a weak banking sector, and deteriorating public finances. In these circumstances, it is difficult to generate growth through purely internal means, and the promotion of exports through a devalued currency becomes the growth engine of last resort. To see why, it's useful to recall the four basic components of growth in gross domestic product, GDP. These components are consumption, C, investment, I, government spending, G, and net exports, consisting of exports, X, minus imports, M. This overall growth definition is expressed in the following equation. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. An economy that is in distress will find that consumption, C, is either stagnant or in decline because of unemployment, an excessive debt burden, or both. Investment, I, in business plant and equipment and housing is measured independently of consumption but is nevertheless tied closely to it. A business will not invest in expanded capacity unless it expects consumers to buy the output, either immediately or in the near future. Thus, when consumption lags, business investment tends to lag also. Government spending, G, can be expanded independently when consumption and investment are weak. Indeed, this is exactly what Keynesian-style economics recommends in order to keep an economy growing even when individuals and businesses move to the sidelines. The problem is that governments rely on taxes or borrowing to increase spending in a recession, and voters are often unwilling to support either at a time when the burden of taxation is already high and citizens are tightening their own belts. In democracies, there are serious political constraints on the ability of governments to increase government spending in times of economic hardship, even if some economists recommend exactly that. In an economy where individuals and businesses will not expand and where government spending is constrained, the only remaining way to grow the economy is to increase net exports, X minus M, and the fastest, easiest way to do that is to cheapen one's currency. An example makes the point. Assume a German car is priced in euros at 30,000 euros. Further assume that 1 euro equals $1.40. This means that the dollar price of the German car is $42,000. That is, 30,000 euros times $1.40 to the euro equals $42,000. Next, assume the euro declines to $1.10. Now, the same $30,000 car, when priced in dollars, will cost only $33,000. That is, 30,000 euros times $1.10 to the euro equals $33,000. This drop in the dollar price from $42,000 to $33,000 means that the car will be much more attractive to U.S. buyers and will sell correspondingly more units. The revenue to the German manufacturer of 30,000 euros per car is the same in both cases. Through the devaluation of the euro, the German auto company can sell more cars in the United States with no drop in the euro price per car. This will increase the German GDP and create jobs in Germany to keep up with the demand for new cars in the United States. Imagine this dynamic applied not just to Germany, but also to France, Italy, Belgium, and the other countries using the euro. Imagine the impact not just on automobiles, but also French wine, Italian fashion, and Belgian chocolates. Think of the impact not just on tangible goods, but also intangibles, such as computer software and consulting services. Finally, consider that this impact is not limited solely to goods shipped abroad, but also affects tourism and travel. A decline in the dollar value of a euro from $1.40 to $1.10 can lower the price of a $100 dinner in Paris from $140 to $110, and make it more affordable for U.S. visitors. Take the impact of a decline in the dollar value of the euro of this magnitude and apply it to all tangible and intangible traded goods and services, as well as tourism, spread over the entire continent of Europe, and one begins to see the extent to which devaluation can be a powerful engine of growth, job creation, and profitability. The lure of currency devaluation in a difficult economic environment can seem irresistible. However, the problems and unintended consequences of these actions appear almost immediately. To begin with, very few goods are made from start to finish in a single country. In today's globalized world, a particular product may involve U.S. technology, Italian design, Australian raw materials, Chinese assembly, Taiwanese components, and Swiss-based global distribution before the product reaches consumers in Brazil. Each part of this supply and innovation chain will earn some portion of the overall profit based on its contribution to the whole. The point is that the exchange rate aspects of global business involve not only the currency of the final sale, but also the currencies of all the intermediate inputs and supply chain transactions. A country that cheapens its currency may make final sales look cheaper when viewed from abroad, but may hurt itself as more of its cheap currency is needed to produce various inputs. When a manufacturing country has both large foreign export sales and also large purchases from abroad to obtain raw materials and components to build those exports, its currency may be almost irrelevant to net exports, compared to other contributions such as labor costs, low taxes, and good infrastructure. Higher input costs are not the only downside of devaluation. A bigger immediate concern may be competitive tit-for-tat devaluations. Consider the earlier case of the 30,000 euro German car whose U.S. dollar price drops from $42,000 to $33,000 when the euro is devalued from $1.40 to $1.10. How confident is the German manufacturer that the euro will stay down at $1.10? The United States may defend its domestic auto sector by cheapening the dollar against the euro, pushing the euro back up from $1.10 to some higher level, even back up to $1.40. The United States can do this by lowering interest rates, making the dollar less attractive to international investors, or printing money to debase the dollar. Finally, The United States can intervene directly in currency markets by selling dollars and buying euros to manipulate the euro back up to the desired level. In short, while devaluing the euro may have some immediate and short-term benefit, that policy can be reversed quickly if a powerful competitor, such as the United States, decides to engage in its own form of devaluation. Sometimes these competitive devaluations are inconclusive, with each side gaining a temporary edge but neither side ceding permanent advantage. In such cases, a more blunt instrument may be required to help local manufacturers. That instrument is protectionism, which comes in the form of tariffs, embargoes, and other barriers to free trade. Using the automobile example again, the United States could simply impose a $9,000 duty on each imported German car. This would push the U.S. price back up from $33,000 to $42,000, even though the euro remained cheap at $1.10. In effect, the United States would offset the benefit of the euro devaluation for the Germans with a tariff roughly equal to the dollar value of that benefit, thereby eliminating the euro's edge in the U.S. market. From the perspective of an American auto worker, this might be the best outcome, since it protects U.S. industry while allowing the auto worker to take an affordable European holiday. Protectionism is not limited to the imposition of tariffs, but may include more severe trade sanctions, including embargoes. A notable recent case involving China and Japan amounted to a currency war skirmish. China controls almost all of the supply of certain so-called rare earths, which are exotic, hard-to-mine metals crucial in the manufacture of electronics, hybrid automobiles, and other high-tech and green technology applications. While the rare earths come from China, many of their uses are in Japanese-made electronics and automobiles. In July 2010, China announced a 72% reduction in rare earth exports, which had the effect of slowing manufacturing in Japan and other countries that depend on Chinese rare earth supplies. On September 7, 2010, a Chinese trawler collided with a Japanese patrol ship in a remote island group in the East China Sea, claimed by both Japan and China. The trawler captain was taken into custody by the Japanese patrol, while China protested furiously, demanding the captain's release and a full apology from Japan. When the release and apology were not immediately forthcoming, China went beyond the July reduction in exports and halted all rare earth shipments to Japan, crippling Japanese manufacturers. On September 14, 2010, Japan counterattacked by engineering a sudden devaluation of the Japanese yen in international currency markets. The yen fell about 3% in 3 days against the Chinese yuan. Persistence by Japan in that course of devaluation could have hurt Chinese exports to Japan relative to exports from lower-cost producers, such as Indonesia and Vietnam. China had attacked Japan with an embargo, and Japan fought back with a currency devaluation, while both sides postured over a remote group of uninhabited rocks and the fate of the imprisoned trawler captain. Over the next few weeks, the situation stabilized. The captain was released, Japan issued a pro forma apology, the yen began to strengthen again, and the flow of rare earths resumed. A much worse outcome had been avoided, but lessons had been learned and knives sharpened for the next battle. A prospective currency warrior always faces the law of unintended consequences. Assume that a currency devaluation, such as one in Europe, succeeds in its intended purpose, and European goods are cheaper to the world and exports become a significant contribution to growth as a result. That may be fine for Europe, but over time, manufacturing in other countries may begin to suffer from lost markets, leading to plant closures, layoffs, bankruptcy, and recession. The wider recession may lead to declining sales by Europeans as well, not because of the exchange rate, but because foreign workers can no longer afford to buy Europe's exports, even at the cheaper prices. This kind of global depressing effect of currency wars may take longer to evolve, but may be the most pernicious effect of all. So currency devaluation as a path to increased exports is not a simple matter. It may lead to higher input costs, competitive devaluations, tariffs, embargoes, and global recession sooner rather than later. Given these adverse outcomes and unintended consequences, one wonders why currency wars begin at all. They are mutually destructive while they last, and impossible to win in the end. As with any policy challenge, some history is instructive. The 20th century was marked by two great currency wars. The First Currency War, 1, ran from 1921 to 1936, almost the entire period between World War I and World War II, including the Great Depression, with which it is closely associated. The Second Currency War, 2, ran from 1967 to 1987 and was finally settled by two global agreements, the Plaza Accord in 1985 and the Louvre Accord in 1987, without descending into military conflict. Currency wars resemble most wars in the sense that they have identifiable antecedents. The three most powerful antecedents of Currency War I, CWI, were the classic gold standard from 1870 to 1914, the creation of the Federal Reserve from 1907 to 1913, and World War I and the Treaty of Versailles from 1914 to 1919. A brief survey of these three periods helps one to understand the economic conflicts that followed. The Classical Gold Standard, 1870 to 1914. Gold has served as an international currency since at least the 6th century BC reign of King Croesus of Lydia, in what is modern-day Turkey. More recently, England established a gold-backed paper currency at a fixed exchange rate in 1717, which continued in various forms with periodic wartime suspensions until 1931. These and other monetary regimes may all go by the name gold standard. However, that term does not have a single defined meaning. A gold standard may include everything from the use of actual gold coins to the use of paper money backed by gold in various amounts. Historically, the amount of gold backing for paper money has ranged from 20% up to 100%, and sometimes higher, in rare cases where the value of official gold is greater than the money supply. The classical gold standard of 1870 to 1914 has a unique place in the history of gold as money. It was a period of almost no inflation. In fact, a benign deflation prevailed in the more advanced economies as a result of technological innovation that increased productivity and raised living standards without increasing unemployment. This period is best understood as the first age of globalization, and it shares many characteristics with the more recent second age of globalization that started in 1989 with the end of the Cold War. The first age of globalization was characterized by technological improvements in communication and transportation, so that bankers in New York could speak on the phone to their partners in London, and travel time between the two financial hubs could be as short as 7 days. These improvements may not have been widespread, but they did facilitate global commerce and banking. Bonds issued in Argentina, underwritten in London, and purchased in New York created a dense web of interconnected assets and debts of a kind quite familiar to bankers today. Behind this international growth and commerce was gold. The classical gold standard was not devised at an international conference like its 20th century successors, nor was it imposed top-down by a multilateral organization. It was more like a club that member nations joined voluntarily. Once in the club, those members behaved according to well-understood rules of the game, although there was no written rule book. Not every major nation joined, but many did, and among those who joined, capital accounts were open, free market forces prevailed, government interventions were minimal, and currency exchange rates were stable against one another. Some nations had been on a gold standard since well before 1870, including England in 1717 and the Netherlands in 1818. But it was the period after 1870 that a flood of nations rushed to join them, and the Gold Club took on its distinctive character. These new members included Germany and Japan in 1871, France and Spain in 1876, Austria in 1879, Argentina in 1881, Russia in 1893, and India in 1898. While the United States had been on a de facto gold standard since 1832, when it began minting 1 troy-ounce gold coins worth about $20 at the time, it did not legally adopt a gold standard for the conversion of paper money until the Gold Standard Act of 1900, making the United States one of the last major nations to join the classical gold system. Economists are nearly unanimous in pointing out the beneficial economic results of this period. Giuliano M. Gallerati, the leading theorist and economic historian of the classical gold standard period, summarizes this neatly in The Anatomy of an International Monetary Regime. Among that group of nations that eventually gravitated to gold standards in the latter third of the 19th century, that is, the Gold Club, abnormal capital movements, that is, hot money flows, were uncommon. Competitive manipulation of exchange rates was rare. International trade showed record growth rates. Balance of payments problems were few. Capital mobility was high, as was mobility of factors and people. Few nations that ever adopted gold standards ever suspended convertibility, and of those that did, the most important returned. Exchange rates stayed within their respective gold points, that is, were extremely stable. There were few policy conflicts among nations. Speculation was stabilizing, that is, investment behavior tended to bring currencies back to equilibrium after being displaced. Adjustment was quick, liquidity was abundant, public and private confidence in the international monetary system remained high. Nations experienced long-term price stability, predictability, at low levels of inflation. Long-term trends in industrial production and income growth were favorable, and unemployment remained fairly low. This highly positive assessment by Gallerati is echoed by a study published by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which concludes, economic performance in the United States and the United Kingdom was superior under the classical gold standard to that of the subsequent period of managed fiduciary money. The period from 1870 to 1914 was a golden age in terms of non-inflationary growth coupled with increasing wealth and productivity in the industrialized and commodity-producing world. A great part of the attraction of the classical gold standard was its simplicity. While a central bank might perform certain functions, no central bank was required. Indeed, the United States did not have a central bank during the entire period of the classical gold standard. A country joining the club merely declared its paper currency to be worth a certain amount in gold and then stood ready to buy or sell gold at that price in exchange for currency in any quantity from another member. The process of buying and selling gold near a target price in order to maintain that price is known today as an open market operation. It can be performed by a central bank, but that is not strictly necessary. It can just as well be performed by a government operating directly or indirectly through fiscal agents such as banks or dealers. Each authorized dealer requires access to a reasonable supply of gold, with the understanding that, in a panic, more gold could be readily obtained. Although government intervention is involved, it is conducted transparently and can be seen as stabilizing rather than manipulating. The benefit of this system in international finance is that when two currencies become anchored to a standard weight of gold, they also become anchored to each other. This type of anchoring does not require facilitation by institutions such as the IMF or the G20. In the classical gold standard period, the world had all of the benefits of currency stability and price stability without the costs of multilateral overseers and central bank planning. Another benefit of the classical gold standard was its self-equilibrating nature, not only in terms of day-to-day open market operations, but also in relation to larger events, such as gold mining production swings. If gold supply increased more quickly than productivity, which happened on occasions, such as the spectacular discoveries in South Africa, Australia, and the Yukon between 1886 and 1896, the price level for goods would go up temporarily. However, this would lead to increased costs for gold producers that would eventually lower production and reestablish the long-term trend of price stability. Conversely, if economic productivity increased due to technology, the price level would fall temporarily, which meant the purchasing power of money would go up. This would cause holders of gold jewelry to sell and would increase gold mining efforts, leading eventually to increased gold supply and a restoration of price stability. In both cases, the temporary supply and demand shocks in gold led to changes in behavior that restored long-term price stability. In international trade, these supply and demand factors equilibrated in the same way. A nation with improving terms of trade, an increasing ratio of export prices versus import prices, would begin to run a trade surplus. This surplus in one country would be mirrored by deficits in others whose terms of trade were not as favorable. The deficit nation would settle with the surplus nation in gold. This caused money supply in the deficit nation to shrink and money supply in the surplus nation to expand. The surplus nation with the expanding money experienced inflation, while the deficit nation with a decreasing money supply experienced deflation. This inflation and deflation in the trading partners would soon reverse the initial terms of trade. Exports from the original surplus nation would begin to get more expensive, while exports from the original deficit nation would begin to get less expensive. Eventually, the surplus nation would go to a trade deficit, and the deficit nation would go to a surplus. Now gold would start to flow back to the nation that had originally lost it. Economists called this the price-specie flow mechanism, also the price-gold flow mechanism. This rebalancing worked naturally, without central bank intervention. It was facilitated by arbitrageurs who would buy cheap gold in one country and sell it as expensive gold in another country, once exchange rates, the time value of money, transportation costs, and bullion refining costs were taken into account. It was done in accordance with the rules of the game, which were well-understood customs and practices based on mutual advantage, common sense, and the profits of arbitrage. Not every claim had to be settled in gold immediately. Most international trade was financed by short-term trade bills and letters of credit that were self-liquidating when the imported goods were received by the buyer and resold for cash without any gold transfers. The gold stock was an anchor or foundation for the overall system rather than the sole medium of exchange. Yet it was an efficient anchor because it obviated currency hedging and gave merchants greater certainty as to the ultimate value of their transactions. The classical gold standard epitomized a period of prosperity before the Great War of 1914 to 1918. The subsequent and much maligned gold exchange standard of the 1920s was, in the minds of many, an effort to return to a halcyon pre-war age. However, efforts in the 1920s to use the pre-war gold price were doomed by a mountain of debt and policy blunders that turned the gold exchange standard into a deflationary juggernaut. The world has not seen the operation of a pure gold standard in international finance since 1914. The creation of the Federal Reserve, 1907 to 1913. The second of the currency war antecedents was the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913. That story has antecedents of its own, and for those one must look back even further to the Panic of 1907. This panic began amid a failed attempt by several New York banks, including one of its largest, the Knickerbocker Trust, to corner the copper market. When Knickerbocker's involvement in the scheme came to light, a classic run on the bank commenced. If the Knickerbocker revelations had occurred in calmer markets, they might not have triggered such a panicked response. But the market was already nervous and volatile after massive losses caused by the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The failure of the Knickerbocker Trust was just the beginning of a more general loss of confidence, which led to another stock market crash, even further bank runs, and finally a full-scale liquidity crisis and threat to the stability of the financial system as a whole. This threat was stemmed only by collective action of the leading bankers of the day in the form of a private financial rescue organized by J.P. Morgan. In one of the most famous episodes in U.S. financial history, Morgan summoned the financiers to his townhouse in the Murray Hill neighborhood of Manhattan and would not allow them to leave until they had hammered out a rescue plan involving specific financial commitments by each one intended to calm the markets. The plan worked, but not before massive financial losses and dislocations had been sustained. The immediate result of the Panic of 1907 was a determination by the bankers involved in the rescue that the United States needed a central bank, a government-established bank with the ability to issue newly created funds to bail out the private banking system when called upon. The bankers wanted a government-sponsored facility that could lend them unlimited amounts of cash against a broad range of collateral. The bankers realized that J.P. Morgan would not always be around to provide leadership, and some future panic could call for solutions that exceeded even the resources and talents of the great Morgan himself. A central bank to act as an unlimited lender of last resort to private banks was needed before the next panic arose. America had a long history of antipathy to central banks. There had been two efforts at something like a central bank in U.S. history prior to 1913. The first of these, the Bank of the United States, was chartered by Congress at the urging of Alexander Hamilton in 1791, but its charter expired in 1811 during the presidency of James Madison. and a bill to recharter the bank failed by a single vote. 5 years later, Madison steered the chartering of a second Bank of the United States through Congress. But this second charter had a limited life of 20 years and would be up for renewal in 1836. When the time for renewal came, the second bank ran into opposition not only in Congress but from the White House. President Andrew Jackson had based part of his 1832 presidential campaign on a platform of abolishing the bank. After a contentious national debate, which included Jackson pulling all U.S. Treasury deposits out of the Second Bank of the United States and placing them in state-chartered banks, the rechartering did pass Congress. Jackson vetoed it, and the charter was not renewed. The political opposition to both national banks was based on a general distrust of concentrated financial power and a belief that the issuance of national banknotes contributed to asset bubbles that were inflated away by easy bank credit. From 1836 to 1913, an almost 80-year period of unprecedented prosperity, innovation, and strong economic growth, the United States had no central bank. Now, literally in the rubble of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and the financial rubble of the Panic of 1907, a concerted effort began to create a new central bank. Given the popular distrust of the idea of central banking, the bank's sponsors, led by representatives of J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and Jacob H. Schiff of the Wall Street firm Kuhn, Loeb & Company, knew that an education campaign to build popular support would need to be conducted. Their political patron, Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, Republican of Rhode Island, who was head of the Senate Finance Committee, sponsored legislation in 1908 creating the National Monetary Commission. Over the next several years, the National Monetary Commission was the platform for numerous research studies, sponsored events, speeches, and affiliations with prestigious professional associations of economists and political scientists, all with a view to promoting the idea of a powerful central bank. In September 1909, President William H. Taft publicly urged the country to consider supporting a central bank. That same month, the Wall Street Journal launched a series of editorials favoring the central bank under the heading, "A Central Bank of Issue." By the summer of the following year, the popular and political foundations had been laid, and it was now time to move toward a concrete plan for the new bank. What followed was one of the most bizarre episodes in the history of finance. Senator Aldrich was to be the primary sponsor of the legislation setting up the bank, but it would have to be drafted in accordance with a plan that satisfied the wishes of New York bankers, still reeling from the Panic of 1907 and still searching for a lender of last resort to bail them out the next time a panic arose. A committee of bankers was needed to draft the plan for the central bank. In November 1910, Aldrich convened a meeting to be attended by himself, several Wall Street bankers, and Abram Piatt Andrew, the recently appointed Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. The bankers included Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb, Frank A. Vanderlip of the Rockefeller-controlled National City Bank of New York, Charles D. Norton of the Morgan-controlled First National Bank of New York, and Henry P. Davison, the most senior and powerful partner at J.P. Morgan & Company, after Morgan himself. Andrew was a Harvard economist who would act as technical advisor to this carefully balanced group of Morgan and Rockefeller interests. Aldrich instructed his delegation to meet under cover of darkness at an isolated railway siding in Hoboken, New Jersey, where a private railroad car would be waiting. The men were told to come singly and to avoid reporters at all costs. Once aboard the train, they used first names only, so that porters could not identify them to friends or reporters once they left the train. Some of the men adopted code names as an extra layer of security. After traveling for 2 days, they arrived in Brunswick, Georgia, along the Atlantic coast, about halfway between Savannah and Jacksonville, Florida. From there, they took a launch to Jekyll Island and checked into the exclusive Jekyll Island Club, partly owned by J.P. Morgan. The group worked for over a week to hammer out the Aldrich Bill, which became the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. It still took over 3 years to pass the Federal Reserve Act, the formal name given to the Aldrich Bill based on the Jekyll Island Plan. The Federal Reserve Act finally passed with large majorities on December 23, 1913, and went into effect in November 1914. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 contained many features promoted by Aldrich and Warburg designed to overcome traditional objections to a U.S. central bank. The new entity would not be called a central bank, but rather the Federal Reserve System. It would not be a single entity, but rather a collection of regional reserve banks guided by a Federal Reserve Board, whose members would not be picked by bankers, but rather by the President and subject to Senate confirmation. On the whole, it looked decentralized and under the control of democratically elected officials. Inside the plan, however, was a de facto mechanism much more in line with the true intent of the Aldrich Party on Jekyll Island. Actual monetary policy, conducted through open market operations, would be dominated by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, since New York was the location of the major banks and dealers with whom the Fed would do business. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York was run by a board of directors and governor, not selected by politicians, but selected by its stockholders, who were dominated by the large New York banks. The result was a Fed within the Fed, run by the New York banks and amenable to their goals, including easy credit for bailouts as needed. Some of these features were changed by subsequent legislation in the 1930s, which centralized power in the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C., where it resides today. In more recent years, the board has been dominated not by bankers, but by academic economists and lawyers, who, ironically, seem even more favorably disposed toward easy money and bailouts than the bankers. Yet, at least through the 1920s, the Fed system was dominated by the New York Fed, under the firm hand of its first governor, Benjamin Strong, who ran the bank from 1914 until he died in 1928. Strong was a protege of Morgan partner Henry Davison, as well as of J.P. Morgan himself. Thus, the circle of Morgan influence on the new Central Bank of the United States was complete. History has its echoes. Decades after the Jekyll Island meeting, Frank Vanderlip's National City Bank and Charles Norton's First National Bank merged to become the First National City Bank of New York, which later shortened its name to Citibank. In 2008, Citibank was the recipient of the largest bank bailout in history, conducted by the U.S. Federal Reserve. The foundation laid by Vanderlip and Norton and their associates on Jekyll Island in 1910 would prove durable enough to bail out their respective banks almost 100 years later, exactly as intended. World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, 1914 to 1919. The last of the antecedents of Currency War I was the sequence of the Great War, the Paris Peace Conference, and the Treaty of Versailles. World War I ended not with surrender, but with an armistice, an agreement to stop fighting. With any armistice, the expectation is that the cessation of hostilities will allow the parties to negotiate a peace treaty, but in some cases the negotiations break down and fighting resumes. Negotiation of a lasting peace was the objective of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. England and France were well aware that the financial bill for the war was about to be presented. They saw the Paris Peace Conference as an opportunity to impose these adjustment costs on the defeated Germans and Austrians. However, a successful negotiation in Paris was by no means a foregone conclusion. Although the German Army and Navy were definitely beaten by November 1918, as of the spring of 1919, no peace treaty had been concluded, and it seemed increasingly unlikely that the Allies would be willing or able to resume the war. Therefore, the reparations negotiations were just that, negotiations. The Allied ability to dictate terms had withered between November 1918 and March 1919 when the subject was taken up. Now Germany would have to be prevailed upon to agree to any plan the Allies devised. The size and nature of German reparations were among the most vexing questions facing the Paris Peace Conference. On the one hand, Germany would be asked to cede territory and some industrial capacity. On the other hand, the more Germany gave up, the less it would be able to pay financial reparations that were also being demanded. France had its eye on German gold, which in 1915 had amounted to over 876 metric tons, the fourth largest hoard in the world after the United States, Russia, and France. While these reparations are often thought of solely in terms of how much Germany could afford to pay the Allies, the picture was considerably more complicated, as both the winners and the losers were in debt. As Margaret Macmillan writes in her book, Paris, 1919, both Britain and France had loaned vast amounts to Russia, which defaulted in the wake of the Russian Revolution. Other debtors, such as Italy, were unable to pay. Yet Britain owed $4.7 billion to the United States, while France owed $4 billion to the United States and another $3 billion to Britain. Virtually none of the debtor nations could afford to repay. The entire mechanism of credit and trade was frozen. The issue was not just one of German reparations to the Allies, but of a complex web of inter-Allied loans. Something was needed to reprime the pump and get credit, commerce, and trade moving again. The optimal approach was to have the strongest financial power, the United States, begin the process with new loans and guarantees on top of those already provided. This new liquidity, combined with a free trade area, might have encouraged the growth needed to deal with the debt burdens. Another approach, also with much to recommend it, was to forgive all the debts and start the game over. While it would be difficult for France to forgive Germany, it would be a relief for France to be forgiven by the United States. The net effect on France would have been positive because the United States was more persistent as a creditor than Germany was reliable as a debtor. In fact, none of these things happened. Instead, the stronger, led by England and France, prevailed upon the weaker, primarily Germany, to pay punitive reparations in cash, in kind, and in gold. Calculation of the reparations and agreement on a mechanism by which reparations would be paid was a nearly impossible task. France, Belgium, and England wanted to base reparations on actual war damages, while the United States was more inclined to consider Germany's ability to pay. The German statistics, however, were abysmal, and no reliable calculation of their ability to pay could be made. The assessment of damages was also impossible in the short run. Many areas were barely accessible, let alone amenable to some sort of appraisal of needed reconstruction. The Allies argued as much among themselves as they did with German representatives about whether reparations should be limited to actual damages, which favored France and Belgium, or should include purely financial costs, such as pensions and soldiers' salaries, which would favor England. In the end, no exact amount of reparations was specified in the Treaty of Versailles. This was the result of the technical impossibility of calculating a number and the political impossibility of agreeing on one. Any figure high enough to enjoy domestic approval in England and France might have been too high for the Germans to agree to, and vice versa. American admonitions for moderation and practicality were largely ignored. Domestic politics triumphed over international economic needs. Instead of a specific number, expert panels were empowered to continue studying the question and make specific findings in the years ahead, which would form the basis for actual reparations. This bought time, but the hard issues on reparations were put off, only to become entangled during the 1920s with the gold exchange standard and efforts to restart the international monetary system. Reparations were like an albatross hung around the neck of the international financial system for the next 15 years. Conclusion. By 1921, the table was set for the first modern currency war. The classical gold standard had acted as an intellectual magnet, a monetary North Star that had framed the debate over what kind of system was needed in the 1920s to restart international capital flows and world trade. World War I and the Treaty of Versailles introduced a new element, not predominant in the gold standard age, of massive, interlocking, and unpayable sovereign debts, which imposed an insurmountable obstacle to normalized capital flows. The creation of the Federal Reserve System and the role of the New York Fed in particular heralded the arrival of the United States on the international monetary scene as the dominant player, and not just another participant. The potential for the Fed to re-liquefy the system through its own money-printing efforts was just coming into full view. By the early 1920s, nostalgic affection for the pre-war classical gold standard, tension over unpayable reparations, and uncertainty about the money power of the Federal Reserve all conditioned the creation of a new international monetary system and the course of Currency War I.